to imagine a world without women. No color, no heterosexual sex, no heterosexual love, no children, no life. 35 years ago, and it shows you how old I am, I made a decision which was to change my life, and I thought I had entered such a world. I walked into the offices of a publishing house in Delhi, and I got myself a job over there. It was a lovely place, warm, friendly, full of good people, full of good ideas. But there was one problem. My female colleagues and I, we might as well have been invisible. Nobody really noticed us. Nobody really talked to us. They were kind, but they thought we had nothing intelligent to say at all. In fact, my bosses, very, very nice men, when they'd interviewed me for the job, had said that they were somewhat reluctant to employ me because, as they said, they didn't want to employ women because women went away and got married and had children. I instantly felt guilty on behalf of all womankind and thought that having children and getting married was a crime, and imagined all my sisters behind bars in various stages of pregnancy. I was 21 years old, deeply involved in the women's movement in India. We campaigned against things like dowry, we fought against rape, we fought for changes in laws on marriage, on inheritance, but we were in some ways fighting blind because we didn't really know what was happening or where anything was coming from. The newspapers told us that X number of women, at the time the figure was 300, it's much higher now, that 300 women were killed every year in India for dowry. Why was this happening? Who were these women? Who were the families? How did they get away? Was it a North Indian phenomenon? Was it a Hindu phenomenon? Was it a middle-class phenomenon? We needed to know. We needed information. We needed knowledge. We needed studies. We needed research. We needed books. I thought, I'm working in a publishing house. Surely they publish all kinds of books. There must be books that can help me to understand. I looked, and I looked, and I looked, and I didn't find one book to help me understand. I asked my bosses, why don't we do books about women? There's a whole lot of stuff going on out there. Why don't we try to publish some studies? They looked bewildered. Women, they said, but what about them? Do they think? Do they write? Do they read? Is there anything to say? It took me several years of trying and not succeeding to decide if they won't do it, I'll do it myself. And I decided that there was no point in living in a world where all the knowledge that we had at hand was about 1/2 of the people of this world, that is, men. How could we ever begin to understand, for example, why women were being killed for dowry, why so many female fetuses were being aborted even before they were born, why so many women were being trafficked, why so much was happening to women, why we didn't see any women or hardly any women in positions of power, why they never made it to workplaces. How could we begin to even understand this if we didn't have the information and the knowledge at hand to try and make sense of what we were seeing around us? In 1984, I and a colleague of mine set up Kali for Women, the first feminist publishing house in India, possibly in Asia, but we know so little that I'm not sure that we can make that claim. Kali, as many of you know, is a Hindu goddess, and she has a very negative aspect, all violent and bloody. But as in much of Hinduism, there is always a positive side to the negative. We chose Kali because Kali is first and foremost a single goddess. She's not a consort, not in the shape and form of Kali. She fights and battles and rages to destroy a world of ignorance, out of which she creates a new world, an inclusive world, a world of knowledge. And we thought Kali was a very, very potent symbol for us, for our new publishing house. We tried to get women to write. At first, nobody took any notice of us. But gradually, this began to change, and women came forward with their writings because when they saw that there were people interested in publishing them, they came up with things they had been hiding for years, that they had been sitting on. When you get accustomed to the habit of silence and to hiding your creativity, it is very difficult to take that step out to start publishing. And this is what was happening to women. So along with receiving the writings that women were doing, we had to work very hard to instill in women the confidence that what they had to say was important, was worth listening to, was worth reading, and was worth spreading in the world. At about the same time, roughly about the same time that I started Kali, I began work on a book. It was a book of interviews with the survivors of Partition of India in 1947. As with many Indians of my generation, I had grown up in a family of partition refugees and with stories of partition all around me, but I had never really paid much attention to them. It was 1984 and the assassination of Indira Gandhi in Delhi that drew my attention to partition. I worked with a number of Indians in Delhi in the refugee camps that had been set up and which you earlier saw that Pablo Bartholomew's pictures had documented. I worked in those camps and I began to listen to people's stories of partition. These people were people who had lived through the violence of 47 and were now reliving it again in a different form in their own country. And I realized that the histories of partition that had been available to us, and not one of them was about women, were histories that looked only at the politics of partition, at leaders, at political parties, and had never addressed what this cataclysmic event meant for ordinary people who had lived through it and survived it. As I went from interview to interview, I began to hear people's stories, began to listen to their silences, the stories they held close to their hearts, the stories that they had carried for so long and no one had really tried to address. As I finished the work on partition, or as I did the work on partition, it made me realize that the same kind of silences that the people, or survivors of partition, had lived through for so many years without talking about them and had been marginalized from the master narrative of history were the kinds of silences that I was encountering when I was talking to women. And I began to ask myself questions. Why is it that we call history an objective discipline when actually all it does is reflect the views and writings of one half of humanity, that is men? Why is it that history is only about kings and rulers and not about ordinary people? Do they not count in the making of history? Why is it that the knowledge that we were generating and the knowledge we were accepting was so hierarchized? Why is it that, for example, histories of financial institutions never talked about the thousands of ordinary people whose savings made up those financial institutions? Did that not count in the system of knowledge? And it was out of questions of such as this that we began to publish books on all aspects to do with women. At first, it wasn't easy, but gradually, it began to get easier. One day, as we were sitting in the sun and talking about what books to publish, a group of women came to see us. These were women from Rajasthan, from a village in Rajasthan, and they came to us with an idea for a book that they had prepared. The book was called Sharir Ki Jankari, Know Your Body, and it was a book that documented what happens to a woman's body from the moment a female child is born till old age, what happens with the onset of menstruation, what happens when sex happens, what happens with pregnancy, what happens through marriage, and so on and so forth. They told us a lovely story about this book. They told us how they had made by hand 2 copies of this book and field tested it in the villages in which they lived. Because the book was about women's bodies, it showed the naked woman's body in order to show female body parts. Everyone in the village laughed at them. And they said to them, but this is not realistic. You never see a naked woman in a village. How can you call this realistic? The women realized the criticism was just. They went back to the drawing board. They thought again about it. And they came up with an ingenious solution. They drew the woman's body and the man's body, because women are egalitarian, and because the changes in the women's body were related with what happened in their relationships with men. They drew the female body, as you would see a woman in a village, fully dressed from head to toe, head covered with the lehenga and the choli, and they drew the male body, as you would see a man in a village in a dhoti with a bare chest. And then they made little flaps that you could see to lift up how the woman was made and how the man is made. That's the woman over there, and that's the man. And then you see the next picture when you lift them up and you see how they're made from underneath. And the whole book was done like that. We were delighted when this book came to us. The experience, and when the women came to us, they said, there are 70 of us who have put this book together. 70 authors. You never see a book with 70 authors. We decided that we were going to publish this book, and we published it, and before we had finished publishing it, the women themselves had sold all the copies that we printed in the villages where they worked. We have published today 70,000 copies of this book. Not one copy has sold through a bookshop. They've all sold in village India. The experience of publishing this book, Sharir Ki Jankari, taught me something else, an extremely vital lesson, and that was that knowledge is not only about the rich and the wealthy, but it is also about the poor. That the business of publishing books is something which is a wonderful business, but you're always aware of the fact that it is a limited business, because books traditionally only reach out to people who can read and write, to people who can afford to buy books, to people who have the time to buy books, and to people who have the leisure to read those books or the desire and inclination to read those books. Here was a group of women who were illiterate writers, because just as readers are people who can afford to buy books, so also writers tend to be people from the elite, from the rich, people who are educated, people who are literate. Here were people breaking those stereotypes. A bunch of women, illiterate women, who had produced this rather wonderful book that crossed the boundaries of class, that crossed the boundaries of gender, that crossed the boundaries of caste, that crossed the boundaries of what is considered good writing. And it was a dream book which we published, and we were very proud to have published it, because for us, this began to break the barriers that you have in publishing and writing about who can write, who can create knowledge, what kind of knowledge there is, and who reads, and who the right kind of readers are. We continued to publish books of this kind. We tried to address marginalized voices in India and looked at books by a domestic worker, people of sexual minorities, a transgender worker, Dalit women, trying to bring to the fore voices that are continuously marginalized by people who make literary and knowledge canons. At some point one day, someone asked us, "Why did you call your publishing house Kali for Women?" And as I proceeded to give the answer to the person which I earlier gave you about the symbol of power that Kali is, and so on and so forth, this woman said to me, "But don't you realize how Kali is such a terribly Hindu name? Have you ever thought why the women's movement in India only ever uses Hindu symbols of empowerment? And don't you think those rule out a whole range of other women who are part of the diversity of this country?" And I began to think, and I realized that all the symbols we used were Durga and Shakti and Kali and Lakshmi and so on and so forth. And that moment coincided with some other changes in our publishing house, and we decided to change the name of our publishing house to Zubaan, which means tongue and voice and speech and language, and which stood for all the things that we wanted to stand for, and it was not a religious name. So that was something that showed that we were willing to make changes, and continuously we went on to make changes. People like us, feminist publishers like us the world over, and alternative publishers like us are battling continuously to change what are considered as the definitions of knowledge, to change the hierarchies that exist in knowledge, to show that knowledge is not only the preserve of the rich and wealthy, and to show that knowledge has the potential for change, and to show that writing and books are something for which there is a huge hunger in this country, and even in this day of electronic changes, it is a need that we need to continuously meet until we can reach the moment where we might be able to make a transition to other forms of knowledge and other ways of looking at knowledge. But it's not an easy existence. It's a very precarious existence. Much of the time, we are terribly strapped for cash. We have to fight continuously against market forces. Every time we innovate and the change becomes sexy, it is taken over by the big market forces, and we have to continually reinvent ourselves and rethink what we are doing. So this was something that we were doing in collaboration with a whole lot of other publishing houses that are working in a similar arena. Now, when you're in the business of change, and when you're talking about creating knowledge and changing the way knowledge is looked at, it doesn't stop there. You can't just congratulate yourself that you have started to do something, and that's it, you've set a trend, and you can actually stop. Knowledge is the first weapon in battling for change. And you have to strategize, once you've started on that path, how to bring that change about in all the sort of things that you are doing. We began to think, how could we take this further? Was there a way in which we could bring our politics into the workplace? Could we create a feminist workplace? Is there even such a thing? Could we bring the principles of feminist functioning into the workplace? Could we create a responsible situation in which hierarchies were recognized, but also responsibility was recognized so that decision-making was taken seriously? Too many workplaces, we felt, are frightened of experimenting. Too many workplaces are frightened of diversity. Too many are frightened of uncertainty. Too many are frightened of change. Too many are frightened of women. And we began to work hard to create a feminist workplace. We're a very small actor on the world of change, on the map of change. But we're not scared of learning. We're not scared all the time of innovating. Some time back, a friend of ours raised another question to us and said to us, you call yourselves inclusive publishers, you call yourself feminist publishers. Have you ever thought of why you have not addressed the question of publishing books for differently abled people? And I had to hang my head in shame at that, because it was so true. India, for example, has the largest population of the blind in the world. There are hardly any publishers who are addressing the need for creating books for the blind, for people who can't hear, for the differently abled. We are not doing that at all, for people of old age people who can't see very well. And that criticism made us turn our attention to trying to bring about this kind of change, just as in the learning process, when I had begun my work on partition, I had discovered, to my shame and horror as a feminist, that one of the histories of partition that I had been completely unaware of was the history of the mass rape and abduction of women, the figure of abducted and raped women reaching 100,000, which is something that I knew nothing about and began learning only when I began to go deep into the histories of people. So feminism for me, which is something that everybody is really scared of, opened up a whole lot of avenues and ways of looking at other marginalized people, in particularly the knowledge sector. I want to end this presentation by drawing your attention to what is perhaps my most precious possession, the book which is 500 years old, or over 500 years old. It is the first book ever to be printed by a woman. What actually happened was that her husband was the printer, he died, and she took over the printing and she printed the book. Today, so much has changed. We don't have to wait for our husbands and lovers to die before we can start doing the work that we are capable of doing. We are actually able to do it so we can stand alongside them, proud and confident in our identities and do the work we are supposed to do. Now, I'd like to end by drawing your attention back to the question I started with. Try to imagine a world without women. Try to imagine now a world with women. Women who are smart, capable, interesting, intelligent, funny, wonderful, and women who can help to create a world which is very, very different, a world of joy, of children, of life, a female world. My colleagues and I, my friends and I, people in the same sector, we are striving to create this kind of world. I've been doing it all my life. I'll continue to do it all my life. A friend once asked me, don't you ever get bored of it? And my answer to her was, you know, there's this terrible hamburger company which has a terribly, somewhat ungrammatical advertisement. I'm loving it. Thank you.